Frank Reynolds had always prided himself on his sense of intuition. As a retired police officer and a longtime resident of his small town, he could sense trouble before it arrived, like an animal instinct. That morning, as he sipped his coffee and watched the sun rise over his lawn, an unsettling feeling crept into his gut, shadowing the serenity of the dawn. The tranquility shattered with a loud, aggressive pounding on his front door, causing Frank's heart to race. He set his coffee down, eyes narrowing as he approached. The knocking was incessant, demanding, as if the knocker believed themselves to be the bringers of bad news. Something was off. He opened the door to find 3 men dressed in ill-fitting uniforms that screamed amateur. They wore cheap polyester shirts and flashed badges that looked like something from a discount print shop. One of them, a burly man with a greasy mustache and mirrored sunglasses, stepped forward. His voice was deep and commanding, but Frank could hear the uncertainty lurking beneath. "Mr. Reynolds," the man said, his tone heavy with authority, "you need to step outside immediately. You are in violation of multiple community ordinances." Frank cocked an eyebrow, arms crossing over his chest. "Community ordinances? And who are you again?" he asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. The mustached man hesitated, begrudgingly producing a laminated card that looked as if it had been printed at the local coffee shop. "We're from the HOA Compliance Task Force, and we've been authorized to enforce regulations." Frank stifled a laugh. The HOA? Those paper pushers had the audacity to demand anything from him. He had lived in his home for 20 years, never once violated a rule, not with the pride he took in his property. "Interesting. And where is it written that I can't paint my house this color?" He gestured at his home, painted in a simple but bold shade of beige siding. The mustache man fumbled for a response. "It's on page 42 of the latest HOA compliance code," he stuttered, glancing at his clipboard, realizing there was no such page. "Seems like you're having a hard time finding the evidence," Frank said, leaning against the doorframe, feigning casual interest. He knew they weren't expecting someone to challenge them. Most homeowners were too intimidated. They would pay the fines and forget about it. But Frank Reynolds had spent years facing real criminals. The men in front of him, they smelled like amateur hustlers trying to play a game. The younger lackey with the clipboard shifted nervously. "You've also been cited for an unauthorized mailbox design and improper driveway parking," he added, his voice a mere squeak compared to his partner's bravado. Frank's eyes narrowed further. Improper driveway parking. He stepped closer, his demeanor calm, every word deliberate. "And what exactly happens if I refuse to comply? Are you threatening me?" Well," the mustached man stammered, his confidence fading fast. "Let me guess, you've already collected some payments today," Frank interjected smoothly. He noticed the way the lackeys exchanged furtive glances, knowing they had just been busted. "How many victims did you shake down on your rounds?" The mustached man's bravado faltered. "You don't understand," he said, attempting weakly to regain control. "These are serious violations. We don't want to escalate this." But Frank, sensing the shift in power dynamics, leaned in closer. "What you don't want, friend, is for me to take this up with the real authorities," he said, his voice low but firm. He felt his right hand resting near his belt where his police radio clipped securely. Playing the role of a compliant citizen, he nodded slowly, acting as if he were considering their demands. "Okay," he said finally, "I'll need to see some documentation before I sign anything." With a sense of false security, the mustached man handed over a flimsy piece of paper, which Frank immediately scanned. No official letterhead, no legal citations, just a list of made-up fines that led nowhere. "What's the penalty if I don't pay?" he asked, eyes locked on the mustache man, watching the sweat bead on his forehead. "Legal action," the second lackey squeaked. "Property liens could be enacted." Frank felt a cold anger washing over him. This wasn't just some petty scam. This was a calculated scheme to extort money from people in his community. But instead of fear, he felt a surge of resolve. The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. Sensing they had lost control, the mustached man's bravado slipped away. "Gentlemen," Frank said, straightening his posture as he sensed freedom approaching on the sirens. Let's talk about who's really under arrest. As the sirens drew nearer, he felt a rush of satisfaction. He hadn't just identified a scam. He was about to dismantle it. With the real law enforcement on the way, the game was about to change, and Frank Reynolds was ready for it. Just then, the realization hit the men. The game was over, and they were caught in it. But as the sirens shrieked and the lights flashed in the morning sun, Frank knew it was not just his victory. This was a chapter that needed to be written for every homeowner who had been pushed around by these so-called enforcers of rules bending laws to suit their greed. The door opened, and the real police officers jumped out, ready to take charge. A familiar rush surged through Frank. This was just the beginning. Chapters of justice were waiting to be unveiled, and he was ready to write them all. As the sirens shrieked and the lights flashed in the morning sun, Frank knew this was not just his victory, it was the community's. The sight of the real law enforcement officers stepping out of their squad cars, determined and ready, filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. He straightened his posture, arms crossed, watching as Deputy Carter and Officer Ruiz assessed the situation, their eyes narrowing with focus. "Boss," Carter said, glancing toward the apprehended trio. "Looks like we've got some wannabe enforcers on our hands." Frank nodded, gesturing toward the mustached man still pressed against the SUV, the grimy badge now practically mocking him. "They seem to think they can intimidate our neighbors and get away with it," Frank replied, his voice steady with authority. "They are running a scam, and it's high time we put an end to it. I want every piece of evidence gathered." Carter moved quickly, securing the mustached man in handcuffs and leading him toward the squad car. Officer Ruiz, meanwhile, stepped over to Frank, eyes filled with curiosity and urgency. "What's our next move, Sheriff? Should we call in for backup?" Frank shook his head, a fire igniting within him. "No backup needed, Ruiz. We're going to gather every record, every fake citation, and then we'll pay a little visit to the HOA office." His tone was resolute, a silent promise to his neighbors who had been victimized for too long. As the deputies began collecting evidence from the SUV, the crowd that had gathered on the street buzzed with murmurs. Frank turned to face them, the faces of his neighbors now alive with hope and curiosity. "Friends," he called out, commanding their attention, "you do not need to fear these men any longer. They have been intimidating you, but today we're sending a message. We will not stand for this." Applause erupted from the gathering crowd, and Frank felt a swell of pride wash over him. They were a community, and together, they would fight against wrongdoings. Within minutes, the SUV was stripped of its fraudulent documentation, including an alarming array of unrealistic fines targeting ordinary homeowners. Each citation more ridiculous than the last. Hundreds of dollars for an untrimmed lawn, threats to file liens for Christmas lights still hung up well past the new year. Frank couldn't believe the audacity. As they worked, Frank caught sight of the youngest enforcer, who remained frozen, hands still raised in surrender. "You," Frank said, pointing at him. "Why did you get involved in this?" The young man glanced nervously at his partners before speaking. "I needed a job. They said it was all just harmless fines. I didn't know." Frank interrupted before he could finish. "This isn't harmless. You've been part of a scheme that exploits your neighbors. Do you really think this is how you want to start your career?" "I didn't sign up for this," the young man exclaimed, his voice cracking with fear. "Then you're going to do the right thing and testify against the others," Frank said firmly, his eyes locking onto the young man's. "Help us put a stop to this." With reluctance, the young man nodded, relief flooding his face as he realized there might be a way out for him, an opportunity to make amends. Just then, the sirens in the distance began to fade as the vehicles were cleared from the scene, and the neighborhood buzzed with excited chatter. Frank knew he had to act fast. "Let's head to the HOA office," he commanded, the urgency in his voice pulling the deputies back into focus. With every piece of evidence securely stowed away, Frank led the way, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had a plan, and this time it was not about intimidation but about justice, a wave of accountability crashing over the people who had taken advantage of vulnerability. As they arrived at the HOA office, a brick building adorned with tasteful landscaping and an air of false propriety, Frank felt the tension in the air. He stepped out of the squad car, straightening his shirt and smoothing back his hair before turning to the deputies. "Remember," he said, "we're not just dealing with petty criminals. This is about protecting our community. Stay sharp." They pushed the door open, the sound echoing down the quiet hallway. Inside, a group of board members sat huddled around a conference table, their faces tightening as they saw the officers enter. Frank could feel the unease radiating from them, a collective realization that their time of intimidation had ended. Reynolds, the HOA president, a tall man dressed in an immaculate suit, spoke with a forced calmness, though it fell flat in the tense atmosphere. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Frank's voice cut through the air, firm and unwavering. "A misunderstanding. I think it's been quite clear that you've been extorting your neighbors, and today, it stops." He laid the stack of fraudulent citations on the table, watching as the president's face paled. Behind him, the deputies fanned out, surveying the room, while the erstwhile enforcers shuffled nervously, still cuffed with no escape in sight. "We've gathered enough evidence to charge you with multiple counts of fraud. You can either cooperate, or we'll take this to the next level." The other board members began to murmur among themselves, their expressions betraying a mix of fear and disbelief. "This is outrageous. You can't do this. We have bylaws and regulations," one shouted, a hint of desperation permeating her voice. "Bylaws that don't allow you to violate the rights of homeowners," Frank countered, staring down the board members one by one. "You've exploited the fear of these good people for too long, and now it's your turn to answer for it." In that moment, it became clear to the board they were no longer in control. Frank felt an exhilarating rush as he watched their demeanor shift, understanding that their empire of fear was crumbling around them. "Collect every single document," he instructed Carter and Ruiz. "We're not leaving until we have it all." As they began to sift through files, receipts, and records, a hush fell over the HOA members. Frank's heart raced. This was more than just a mission for justice. It was about safeguarding his community, returning peace and security to every homeowner who had been bullied into silence. With each piece of evidence they uncovered, Frank felt the weight of hope settle into the hearts of those waiting outside. The sudden loud ping of the cash drawer snapping shut echoed through the room like thunder, and Frank knew this chapter was only just beginning. With each piece of evidence they uncovered, Frank felt the weight of hope settling into the hearts of those waiting outside. The sudden loud ping of the cash drawer snapping shut echoed through the room like thunder, signaling a moment of reckoning. He glanced around the room, seeing the fear increasingly etched on the faces of the board members as they realized their scheme was unraveling. Carter and Ruiz continued their search, flipping through stacks of paperwork that detailed a web of lies and deceit. The room, once filled with the smug self-importance of the HOA board, now felt stifled with regret and apprehension. Each citation they presented drove the point home. These men and women had abused their positions, exploiting the vulnerabilities of their neighbors. "Look at this," Ruiz called out, holding up a thick ledger that had been hidden beneath a pile of other documents. "It details the payouts they've been making for fines. There are even names here, people who've been caught in this web." Frank moved closer to see. There, among the lists of homeowners and outrageous fines, was evidence of everything he had suspected. Names like Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Jenkins flashed before him, bringing with them a rush of righteous anger. "These do not just represent numbers. These are real people who have lost trust and sleep because of your greed," he said, his voice rising in intensity. The board president's facade crumbled as he stammered. "You wouldn't be able to prove anything. We have bylaws." "Bylaws don't give you the right to extort," Frank interrupted, taking a step forward, his eyes dark and intense. "Hiding behind rules when you know you're doing something wrong is not being a leader. It's cowardice." As Frank spoke, the weight of his words hung in the air, carrying the collective disappointment and anger of the community. The elderly residents outside, who had walked away from this fight feeling defeated and powerless, were now gaining a semblance of strength with each moment that passed. "I suggest you start taking responsibility," Frank continued, keeping his voice steady, controlled. "You will issue full refunds to every homeowner you've extorted, or we'll make sure the consequences are ruinous." Fear flickered in the president's eyes, and Frank could see the realization of what they'd lost. Their power was diminishing, the community's trust shattered, and the facade of respectability burned away. The board members whispered urgently among themselves, their earlier bravado transformed into panic. Suddenly, one of the women at the table stood up. "This isn't fair," she protested, her voice trembling. "We were just trying to maintain the neighborhood standards." "Standards?" Frank echoed, incredulous. "You call terrorizing neighbors and robbing them of their peace-maintaining standards. You were playing a game of control, and I'm here to make sure it ends today." A moment of tense silence hung in the air before another board member, a wiry man with thinning hair, spoke up, his voice cracking slightly. "You think this is just us? There's a whole system behind us. This goes higher than you can imagine." "Perfect," Frank said, eyes narrowing, determination hardening in his chest. "Then we'll bring this higher. But don't think you can use that as a way to escape responsibility. You will pay for your actions, regardless of how deep this goes. The law will prevail." The deputies continued their search, gathering the remaining records, and it wasn't long before they found a series of emails between the board members discussing ways to keep the scam under wraps. With each piece of incriminating evidence, the future of the HOA grew dimmer. When Ruiz discovered the records of home visits and intimidation tactics, Frank felt the rush of a thunderous victory. It was time to show those in power that the community would no longer stand idly by. As they worked, Frank allowed his mind to wander, imagining how life would be for his neighbors once this nightmare was over. The laughter of children playing in the yard, barbecues on warm summer nights, and families coming together, free from the threat of phony fines. This was what he fought for. Before leaving the office, Frank turned to the board members, who sat in stunned silence, their aspirations of intimidation shaken. "You have until the end of today to refund every cent you've taken from your neighbors. I'll be back to collect. If you don't comply, there will be criminal charges filed. And believe me, your lives will change forever." With that, Frank led his deputies out into the busy sunshine, the weight of the evidence in their hands and the echoes of anger in their hearts providing a sense of resolve. Outside, the community had gathered in greater numbers, fueling their collective spirit, emboldened by the promise of justice. As he stepped out of the office, he felt a wave of energy wash over him, knowing they had sparked a movement. People came forward to greet him, smiles breaking through their worn faces, expressions of hope replacing fear. "Sheriff," Mrs. Henderson called, her voice above the crowd. "Does this mean we'll be getting our money back?" "It does," Frank responded, feeling the warmth of camaraderie swell. "But more importantly, it means you've taken your power back. Don't be afraid to question authority. You have every right to demand accountability." As the crowd cheered, Frank felt the gravity of the moment. Justice was not merely a concept, it was a dynamic force embodied in the faces of his neighbors. They would rise together, stripping away the silence that had so long held them captive. With his heart pounding and purpose resolute, Frank stepped forward. The battle had begun, and with it, a future ripe with the potential of redemption and return could now blossom. And for everyone standing there, they would never again feel powerless against those who used fear as their weapon. Together, they would forge a community based on trust, respect, and truth. With his heart pounding and purpose resolute, Frank stepped forward. The battle had begun, and with it, a future ripe with potential for redemption and return could now blossom. And for everyone standing there, they would never again feel powerless against those who used fear as their weapon. Together, they would forge a community based on trust, respect, and truth. In the days that followed, Frank and his deputies became the unwavering backbone for the community. Word spread about the HOA scandal, and the courage of the neighbors ignited a newfound vigilance across town. Town hall meetings that had once been characterized by whispers and fear were now overflowing with voices united in strength. Frank watched as residents stood up for one another, sharing their experiences, lending support, and demanding their rights be upheld. The energy was electric as frustration transformed into purpose. People began to talk openly about the injustices they had faced, not just from the HOA, but from other authoritative figures who had pushed them around for far too long. With Frank by their side, they began outlining a plan for a new neighborhood association, one rooted in fairness, transparency, and accountability. On one sunny Saturday morning, Frank stood in front of a gathering of villagers in the town square. Treated like a hero, he sensed the weight of responsibility resting on his shoulders. "We're taking it back, friends," he shouted, raising his hands to stir the crowd. "This is our community. None of us are alone anymore. Together, we will ensure that everyone feels safe and valued." As the crowd erupted with cheers, Frank felt a surge of hope. He encouraged them to form committees, to share responsibilities and ideas. The spirit of collaboration transformed him from a mere enforcer of the law to a catalyst for real change. No longer just a sheriff holding a badge, he had now become a leader, an advocate for a vision that extended far beyond the scope of disregarded fines. Weeks turned into months, and the repercussions of the scandal rippled through every corner of the community. The board members, facing mounting pressure, were ultimately forced to resign, compelled to issue refunds as promised. The sense of justice brought newfound confidence, reinforcing the belief that standing up for what was right was worth the struggle. But that momentum wasn't without challenges. As a new neighborhood association formed, dissenters emerged. A small faction of former board members, left embittered by their failure, was determined to regain their grip on the community. They worked to sabotage the new leadership, spreading disinformation and attempting to instill fear. Frank remained vigilant. He had anticipated this backlash, understanding that change often faced resistance. But he reassured the community. "Let them spread their poison," he said during one of the newly organized town meetings, his voice steady. "Fear cannot extinguish the fire of hope and community spirit that we've ignited." Word traveled quickly. A rally was planned at the town hall, a show of unity to put an end to the negativity. Neighbors rallied together, each bringing their unique flair to the event. Homemade banners, baked goods for all to share, and an impromptu performance from the local high school band. It was a genuine celebration of togetherness, and Frank felt the warmth of camaraderie envelop him. On the day of the rally, residents filled the town hall, energized and united. Frank stood before them, hearts swelling with pride. "This is not just about kicking out those who tried to control you," he began, his words resonating within the walls. "This is about cultivating a community that stands for one another, a community that thrives on perspectives, suggestions, and respect." As cheers erupted, he encouraged open dialogue. The atmosphere was electric, filled with the palpable shift from fear to empowerment. People shared stories of how they had helped each other, repairing fences, looking after each other's children, and even brainstorming ways to beautify shared spaces. From barriers built of mistrust, bridges formed of love and cooperation emerged. Yet, amid the celebration, Frank kept a watchful eye on the corners of the gathering. He had no illusions that they were entirely free of opposition. He noticed a handful of dissenters, arms crossed, the irritation evident on their faces. They had come to sabotage the gathering with scornful remarks and veiled threats. But the community was resolute. Negativity bounced off like raindrops on a shield. And then, unexpectedly, one of the former board members, Anna, stood up. Frank recognized her as one of the most vocal opponents during the scandal. But today she wore a different expression. The tension in the room shifted as she cleared her throat. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, her voice shaky but sincere. "Perhaps I was wrong. I believed that power meant control, and I see now that it means something entirely different. I've learned a lot from watching how you all came together, how you stood for one another." Surprised, Frank didn't know what to say, but the crowd responded with a mixture of disbelief and cautious acceptance. Encouraged, Anna continued, "I want to help. If you will have me, I want to be part of this community, not just a leader over it, and I apologize for what I contributed to. I hope you can forgive me." A moment of silence passed, and then slowly, people began to applaud. Frank felt a rush of warmth wash over him. It wasn't just about forgiving her but recognizing that even those who erred could find a path to redemption. "Thank you, Anna, for your honesty," Frank said, beaming. "We're stronger together, and this community can only grow through understanding and empathy." That day marked the beginning of a new chapter in their story, a commitment to inclusivity and growth that extended beyond mere survival against adversity. They began working together to create a charter for the new neighborhood association, written by the hands of many, ensuring everyone's voice mattered. As the sun set over the town, the horizon gleamed with the promise of fresh beginnings. Frank stood outside, watching families gather, laughter erupting like music through the air. The burden of fear had transformed into a foundation built on trust, and he realized that this community was not just recovering, it was evolving, and he was honored to be a part of it. And with every challenge they faced, Frank understood that they were forging a legacy together, one that would empower generations to come. A legacy of courage, unity, and an unwavering spirit of community.